Hi, I'm Mike,
And I'm Aaron,
and you're listening to Thought Fuzz.
the only podcast hosted by Mike and Aaron, where we debate the big ideas behind the big issues you're debating today.
This week, we're discussing
What is an act of war?
truly,
What was that, eh? You did say more bacon, eh?
yeah, truly,
More bacon?
truly, without a position on the world stage.
And yet with many thoughts. So, so today we're going to talk about...
Well, we'll talk around Russia. I mean, really,
Around Russia.
It's about what is an act of war.
what is an act of war?
Right. Let me pose a question to you.
Pose it.
The year is 2014. Russia invades. Russia, they don't directly invade, but what they do is they send soldiers across the border in unmarked uniforms with Russian weapons that they claim were belonging to or to military forces in eastern Ukraine. They send these soldiers, these quote-unquote little green men, into eastern Ukraine to assist with a separatist movement. Now, Ukraine sees this territorial grab as an existential threat to its nationhood. No Western powers are directly involved. And yet, in 2014, it becomes very apparent that we may get involved in this war. And many people refer to it as an act of war.
Conflict.
Conflict, right. Conflagration. There, I used a nice 10-cent word for you. Mm-hmm. If I don't attack Aaron, but I attack something between Aaron and myself, am I not, by Aaron's Fiore example, in effect attacking him?
Well, that's a good question.
Here's another question. Let's say I don't use military force at all. Let's say I cut off power lines to your country. Mm-hmm. You know, oil comes from my country on pipelines through yours, off to customers elsewhere. And I shut it off. You can't heat your homes anymore. Is that an act of war? What if I hack your election systems? And so maybe I don't even tip the scales one way or another, but I make everybody suspicious of the results. Is that an act of war? I'm attacking your economic system. I'm attacking your industrial systems. I'm attacking your political systems. But no soldiers in the traditional sense are involved. There's no invasion. There's no violence. It's just a series of destabilizing acts. Does that constitute an act of war?
These are good questions.
Thank you. All right, that's our show. Thank you very much. Click,
Well, good questions deserve good answers.
click, rate, and subscribe. Is that what they say?
Yeah, that's what they say, isn't it?
Yeah. The kids these days?
A like, subscribe, follow us on Twitter, Facebook,
Snapchat.
Instagram, Snapchat, a Tinder. What else is there?
SoundCloud, Last.fm.
Yeah.
MySpace.
Yeah.
What was that? What was like the big original one? Friendzone?
Friend Zone.
No, I don't think it was called that. No, before MySpace.
Second Life.
Second Life. Yeah, follow us on our Second Life Safari. Yeah.
Okay, so
Join our guild in World of Warcraft.
can you imagine if we actually did that?
Find us in Lumbridge and RuneScape.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Meet us at the Wildy.
So
Focus.
An act of war. So what we're talking about is we're trying to draw some kind of a line
Right.
here, and it seems to me
A line in the sand.
across this line, you do not. Also, dude, Chinaman is not the preferred nomenclature. Asian American, please.
Walter. All right.
Don, you're out of your element. Okay, so yeah, it seems like we're trying to draw a line
In the sand.
and in the sand, and the line, that line being, what ought to be recognized as acceptable conduct
Right.
in the forum of world sort of geopolitical antagonism,
Right.
and what ought be recognized as beyond acceptable, right? So by to break that down a little bit, there's a number of things that every major country, and perhaps even minor countries, try to do or get involved in one way or another,
Right.
which I think are broadly described as sort of foreign or a geopolitical antagonism. So by that I mean spying, right? Information gathering, and the infiltration of various or different countries' political systems, with either online or their infiltration by generating conflicts of interest in opposing politicians, for example.
Right.
Like, let's just say if Russia wanted to, take down a particular American politician, they might, say, enlist some private companies
Right.
from Russia who give them a government-supported job and make sure that they can't trace it back to
All
them.
hypothetical.
Right, and then
All hypothetical.
Yeah, of course. And I'm just hypothesizing. And then that Russian company
This couldn't happen.
might seek out that particular politician or one of his like shell economic associations and attempt to do a deal with them, and then try and do a deal that walks the line closer and closer to the personal involvement of said politician, such that once they've established some kind of economic connection, they can then either have direct influence funding wise over that politician, or be in a position where they're holding some kind of secret information about what that politician is actually connected to in Russia, and then blow that information.
Again, all hypothetical.
Yeah, at the last moment. Right.
Like a hypothetical piss tape, if you
Sure,
will.
something like that, or anything else, right? But point being, this is or ought to be recognized as standard geopolitical fare, right?
This is just
right. This is what
spycraft.
countries do, right?
Right.
And countries do that, I would think, broadly speaking, to support their interests,
Right.
Right. Not necessarily to directly benefit their own people, but it could also be to directly benefit the security, the global security position of them or their allies, or something down the line, right? Investing in some kind of destabilization of potential adversaries,
Right.
so that the destabilization you're causing is preemptive,
Right.
and easier, right? And it's kind of like what America is doing with Iran, right? America is extremely hostile to Iran right now, not necessarily because Iran is some sort of superpower,
Right.
Like China, right? They're hostile to Iran in a way that you might think is disproportionate to Iran's size, and
You might.
and global geopolitical worth.
Right.
But then their argument is that, I'm sure, that Iran actually does deserve this much attention because they have potential to
Right.
be this major global power, this major, important, at least regional power, and
Right.
they need to jump on that very quickly, right?
Right.
Anyways. So so that's kind of the groundwork, right? We're talking about all of this general geopolitical antagonism that goes on. And then what, if anything, falls outside of that?
Right.
Right? So taking this incident in the Ukraine, does that incident qualify as Russia, for example, merely taking advantage of certain social movements in a geopolitically antagonistic way for its own benefit, or is it something like taking over the Sudetenland or
Well, okay. I mean, that implies that there needs to be a difference, right?
No. I'm just.
I mean,
I'm just sort of outlaying the
I would
question.
hate to make comparisons, lazy comparisons to the grabbing of the Sudetenland, because
Okay. Can
the
I
study of history. This is just a minor point, but the study of history has this weird thing where it's just now like pre and post World War II. Is like World War II is the be all end all event of human history.
Right.
200,000 years of anatomically modern human beings have just led up to World War II, and now we're all just like, well, that happened.
We're talking about Hitler.
Yeah,
No, so
exactly.
the better example was not the Sudetenland, but what's the when Germany was going into France, they marched into
World War
Lorraine.
II?
No, yeah, and then World War II. No, but I mean when they were preparing to go into France, they just marched troops into that region.
Belgium?
No. This is before they were formally at war with France. They like the Alsace-Lorraine region, but it wasn't that specifically. It was something else. It was called something else. Anyways, they marched troops in there. And it was
Rhineland.
it was a part of France, but they were German speakers there, and they kind
Yeah.
of welcomed them, right?
Right.
Right. So that seems to be more of an apt comparison here, because apparently this breakaway, this South Ossetia region, is that it?
No, South Ossetia is in Georgia.
Oh, Georgia. I'm sorry. What's the region called we're talking about? Yeah.
I mean, in the news, you'll hear it referred to in a number of ways. Donbass region.
That's right, Donbass. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the separatists call it Novorossiya.
Right.
New Russia.
Right. And so exactly. So
Which
as
my
I
understanding is it's a term from the imperial era of Russian history.
But
that's
the
old
local
history.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the local population is allegedly pro-Russia, and they're Russian speakers, and
Right.
this is the
there's a plurality of ethnic Russians in the region.
right, and they have this ethnic
And-
claim to unite back with Russia.
Right.
Apparently, and that's one part of what started this conflict, right?
Right.
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 Okay, so your question is that an act of war? Right. So what are
right.
the three things? There was the Donbass issue, the alleged hacking of American elections,
Right.
and what was the third one? Oh, this. Well, we should talk about the spy poisoning as well. I'm not sure we mentioned that yet. So about a month ago, a former.
At the time of this recording,
yeah.
depending on when you choose to listen to it,
That's right.
dear readers, and contribute to our Patreon.
This spy named Sergei Skripal, who was a double agent for MI6,
Right.
Working in the KGB. He, I believe, it was the KGB, but anyway, he was poisoned. He and his daughter were poisoned ostensibly by some sort of nerve agent, and the British government immediately decided to indict Russia for the poisoning, and it's turning out that it's very difficult to actually prove that Russia had anything to do with it. And right now there's a controversy as to whether this rush to judgment, ultimately right or wrong, is indicative of the British government's sort of Russophobia and desire to really stick it to Russia regardless of what the truth may be. And so, again, Russia's in the news and under diplomatic pressure from Britain and the rest of the world.
Right.
And rightly or wrongly. And the truth of that spy poisoning will certainly come out, I'm sure.
Right.
Even though, let's face it, the Litvinenko situation is somewhat similar. And the truth of that hasn't really come out yet either. But never mind. So what do you think, Mike? I just talked for a bit. Do you think there are acts of war?
Yes.
So, and if you say yes, what you're saying is that you think that these actions,
Very shaky.
shaky table, that these actions are beyond the line of what's acceptable in typical geopolitical antagonism.
Here's where it gets sticky.
That's the definition that I set here, right?
Okay. Well,
Not that you have to agree to it, but that's, I feel like that's a reasonable line to draw, right?
it is.
All right.
Within reasonable. Okay. Well, there might be an issue with that. And I'm just going to shoot from the hip on
Sure,
this one.
please.
Haven't
Oh,
done
we're all
too
shooting.
much prep for this one, but I suspect that more often than not, the state of affairs on a global stage more closely resembles a kind of war than not. than a kind of peace. I'm not the kind of person who believes in zero-sum geopolitics, where one person necessarily wins and one person necessarily loses. And I am not a cynic with regards to the state of global peace such as it is. That having been said, there is constant competition, and there are broad alliances and broad adversarial relationships between major powers like China, Russia, the United States, the European Union, so on and so forth. And they are resorting, or not, I shouldn't say resorting, it is very normal for them to use many of the tactics that might otherwise be used in war, outside of war, including but not limited to, financial sabotage, hacking of computer systems, very aggressive espionage, right? I think if you look at the 2016 election and what the Russians were able to achieve, I don't believe that they necessarily had some master scheme to put Donald Trump in there. I do think they had a scheme for whoever won to sow discontent and suspicion around the American electoral system, and it can't be ignored that has a massive ideological benefit. It's an ideological target. If, as a Western power, you criticize Putin's democracy as sham democracy and his rule as a kind of dictatorship, what better way to neutralize that argument than to attack the electoral system, right? And so, in a war of ideas, Cold War style, this is absolutely an act of war. And then the question then becomes, I think, well, what encompasses war necessarily, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so we
it was a little rambly, I know.
No. So we said the term Cold War, right? So one of the classic sort of modern historical questions is, was the Cold War a war, right? And if it was, in what sense was it a war? And
right.
one broad answer, and it has its supporters, is that the Cold War was a war. However, it was a war fought with much different. What's the word? A war fought
with proxies, certainly.
With atypical conventions,
right?
So as opposed to having battlefield, a warfare being the principal linchpin of the war, we instead have things like aggressive espionage, financial sabotage, geopolitical machinations,
right,
and the funding of where battlefield clashes existed,
political sabotage,
proxies,
right,
proxies. So and there's a good case to be made, I think, that the Cold War was in fact a war.
Well, yeah,
rather than as what might be a competing claim, rather than a period of simply aggressive espionage and foreign relations.
Right. If you're prosecuting a war effort against another power, it's not unlike this is such a cliche explanation, but I'm going to pursue it anyways. If you're prosecuting a war effort, it's not unlike investments to a certain extent. And that extent is you're trying to minimize risk to yourself and maximize gains at the expense of another party, right? If you can avoid putting a battalion of soldiers on a battlefield and instead simply assassinate a political leader or destabilize a country's finances, or in this case, debase their political system and the ideologies that surround it, thereby weakening their decision-making powers on a national scale, odds are greater than not that you will choose these other options rather than seeking outright physical conflict. So that's to that extent, I suppose you could say the Cold War was a hot war.
Yeah, well, that's certainly one argument,
Right.
That can be made, right?
Right.
The reason to resist it, or one reason to resist that kind of argument, that position, might be that it, if you take that position, then you're kind of blurring the lines quite significantly between what we normally define as typical state-to-state activity and formal conflict.
Right.
Right. And you might have a political reason for doing that, right? Let's just say if you're a pacifist, say, and your goal is to achieve a state of affairs where no antagonistic relationship exists between two states or between any state,
seeking a casus belli for any reason,
or that as well, or on the opposite side,
you might so expand the nature of war so as to make it seem that you are not the first actor.
Exactly. Right. So I don't think you're one of those in this conversation. I don't think you're one or the other. But
this conversation is totally weightless. I'm spitballing.
Yeah, but it has interesting implications, right?
Right.
And for me, I tend to be on the side of trying to preserve the definition of formal conflict.
There's actually I kind of like your argument here, and I'll explain why. If you devalue the definition of war or expand it, Yeah, I should say. Yeah. If you expand it by definition, you also, how do I say this? You take the power away from the images of war.
Well, there's
right?
that too.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to respect war for its destructive capacity. And there's by no argument that requires much explanation do we need to. We don't really need to set too great a difference between dropping bombs on a factory and cutting off the supply chain to the factory.
Right.
There's clearly a difference here.
Right.
And
it's funny you say that, because now we did a podcast two podcasts ago. We were talking about about martial arts and things like that, right? And
right.
I'm not sure we talked about this specifically, so if I'm repeating myself, you let me know. But this precise point that you just made,
right,
is one of the reasons why I really dislike how we use violent metaphors and violence talk in our society.
Right.
Because circumstantially, as our civilian life has become less and less violent,
right,
overtly violent, our civilian speech becomes more and more replete with violence metaphors. And a perfect example of this is American culture. American culture has a war on Christmas, has a war on drugs, has a war on women, it has a war on everything. War on guns.
A war on God.
War on God. War on
armadillos.
War. And war on everything. Everything's a war, right? Every conflict, right, is hyperbolized with this image of warfare.
Right.
But when you do this, one of the risks is that you actually you oversaturate, you dilute.
That's the word I was looking for earlier.
Yeah. You dilute the what ought to be recognized as the proper image of warfare, such that when warfare actually when real warfare rears its ugly head, or let's use a less rhetorical term, when real formal conflict rears its head,
right?
One ought to be struck by the gravity and of the potential of that thing, right? Because war being what it is, in actuality, it ought to be a thing which gives us pause. But if we dilute that metaphor throughout our society constantly, throughout our politics, the language of our politics, as well as our civilian life, then when it comes time to make a decision as to whether to engage in a formal war or not, maybe we've become desensitized to it, right?
Right.
And we might make a rash decision. And I think certainly with returning to this Russia concept, or this Russia topic,
right.
The recent spate of Russophobic rhetoric in our politics reveals that not only are there many politicians today who are more than willing to talk about wars with foreign nations still. Even
Right.
we're not even out of the 100 years out of the shadow of World War II. And the Vietnam War, even less so. And anyways, but there's lots of politicians who would gladly use the term war in describing the relations between two formal major nation states, and in particular between Russia and in the West right now. And there have been formal political speeches in the British Parliament, in particular, after this spy poisoning, where the terms war and Russia have been used, and not ironically.
Right.
And that's pretty scary. That's
not
pretty
hypothetically
crazy.
either.
No, not at all.
Well, okay, let's go back to the point then that I made earlier. Now, again, I don't necessarily agree with this point. I think it's just one worth airing. If an act of war is such that it can negatively influence your balance of power with another nation, if they attack your political systems, if they wage a war on your ideas, or wage a war on your economy, your financial systems, you use the term Russophobia, and I think that's very interesting. Now, if we're talking about phobia, I take that to mean irrational fear. But if you're talking about Russophobia with regards to an irrational fear of the ethnicity of Russians, let's say, that term already exists. It's called racism, right?
Right.
You're just being racist. But
Snow on the boots.
but if you're talking about a fear of Putin-led Russian government, let's say, and we use the term Russophobia, tacking that up to just a limitation of language, I wonder, is it irrational? And if history is our guide, does it preserve the notion that we just attacked, that war is this broader concept? If we can see that Russia, by financial or economic or political means, is encroaching on the security of other nations in advance of an ability to move troops or enact physical war.
Well, okay, so I'm going to actually go, excuse me, go on a limb a little bit.
Right.
And I'm going to propose a somewhat relativistic definition of that line.
Oh.
Right? I'm gonna try and make it a moving target.
Okay.
So, my ulterior motive is to strike at the fundamental hypocrisy of Western governments. So watch for it.
This may be our last episode.
Is that a knock at the door?
Yeah.
Better not touch the doorknob. So they put apparently they put the poison on the doorknob at the guy's apartment. That's
I thought you meant like it's a metal doorknob. They're going to shock the doorknob when you.
Is that a thing?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I think that's from Home Alone.
Oh, is it? Oh, could be.
It might be.
Yeah.
I think it's from Home Alone.
Yeah. Oh, that's heat though. That's heat.
Right.
Not shock. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't believe I knew that. But anyways, okay. So if I'm gonna bring it back to an interpersonal metaphor as well, because I find that helpful. So if I'm if I'm a biker.
Okay.
And I usually hang out.
Not a cyclist, but a biker.
A biker, like like a Hell's Angels biker.
Okay.
Hell's Angels biker. I'm part of a biker gang, say,
Okay.
and I normally I'm talking in terrible stereotypes here, but just for the sake of the metaphor or the image. I'm a Hell's Angels biker. I'm in a biker gang, and I hang out at a pretty rough bar, right?
As you are wont to do.
Let's just say, right?
Right.
And the way this bar works is that it's full of bikers, and it's full of pretty rough characters, and minor violence happens throughout the day, all day, every day.
Right.
And so as long as the people involved within a little spate of violence deal with it themselves and don't affect other people around them, the management of the bar doesn't get involved. And neither do your biker captains or whatever, right? Like if I have I'm drinking across from, my name is Butch. I'm drinking across from you. Your name is Merle or whatever. Right. And we get into a fist fight and beat the crap out of you and give you a black eye. But we take the fight outside or something and we don't break too much stuff. Our bosses in the bar doesn't really care.
I mean,
right?
Yeah.
Right. And So, but even if you were from a rival gang, let's just say, like a rival group or a rival, I don't know, club of different
Right.
chapter of Hell's Angels or whatever, right?
Right.
Point being that there's an environment where that kind of violence is not is regular enough to be recognized as not above the ordinary, right? So just seeing it or engaging in it does not mean that it means, or just engaging in that kind of violence in that environment does not mean there's going to be a major biker war.
Okay.
Right? It has its implications are clearly defined, right? Or
Right.
right? And its implications are in part defined by its frequency,
Right.
right? So
Interesting concept.
so if I'm a country
Okay.
and this is what I'm going to allege here. If I'm a country and I frequently and consistently engage in aggressive espionage
Right.
and foreign antagonism, I am always hiring people to fiddle with foreign economies and economic systems, to surreptitiously bribe or disgrace politicians that are part of political parties in various countries to which I have competing interests and things like that, or employing government agencies or private agencies, contractors, which is very popular, to seek to commit electronic espionage of some degree on different countries, or to test different countries' security, internet security protocols, and see if you can gain information, all that sort of thing, right? Have positive relationships with black market information brokers,
Right.
and with the potential of getting something useful that you can formally use in your political systems, those sort of things. If I'm a country who does that,
Right.
I would think that it would be unreasonable
Right.
if that was done to me to then stand up in the middle of the bar and say, hey, he punched me. We should kill them all. This is clearly an act of war,
Right.
right? And that seems fairly intuitive to me. And if for no other reason that if you engage in that stuff all the time, you ought not be surprised if that stuff gets targeted towards you, right? Number one. Now, that's not to say that I'm saying that it's okay to do those sorts of things. I'm not saying that that's okay. But what I am saying is that that situation doesn't seem to me to be an example of a situation ripe for all-out conflict, right? Whereas, in the opposite way, if I never did any of those things, right? I never messed around with other people's countries. I never employed people to, find information or destroy other politicians or any of that. I didn't do any of that. I completely kept to myself as a country, and I only engaged in philanthropic works, say. And then I found out that one of my neighbors or another country engaged in those sort of things towards me.
Right.
I think it would be much more reasonable to go to that country and say, look, we never do these things.
Right.
You did these things to us. We find this unacceptable in principle for anyone to do, and we are an example of that. We are going to treat this action with the utmost seriousness.
Right.
Right? That seems appropriate to me. That seems at least more appropriate,
So,
right?
what this seems to imply then is that at the first point of subversive activity by a foreign power, a nation has a choice whether to escalate to war or to respond in kind, theoretically speaking.
Right.
If this nation had never done this before, but had been the recipient of espionage in one form or another, they can choose either to escalate to war, in which case it's theoretically just,
Potentially, yeah.
or respond in kind and pursue acts of espionage in their own capacity.
Right.
Now,
So, and
is that
just to cut to the chase, my
Right.
formal argument is then that none of these actions by Russia in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say, are in any way constitute acts of war, because
acts of war at the very least against the West,
against the West,
not against
Well,
Ukraine, obviously.
yeah, against the West, because the Western world engages in the exact same kinds of activities all the time, and they are prohibited. In my view, they're prohibited from claiming or crying foul and act of war due to their own actions.
Okay.
And if they did, which they do, they're being nothing but hypocrites. And so they have to cease those actions in order to get to claim acts of war if it's the similar things in the future.
I suppose that okay. Now you did mention that the point you're making is by nature relativistic. I wonder though if there isn't something to be said about the substance of the actions.
Oh, certainly.
Okay, now,
Yeah.
just before you continue, let me put it to you like this.
Yeah, please.
Russian disinformation campaigns have flooded through Western Europe and North America and Australia, the Western world generally, to influence elections one way or another. Now,
Allegedly,
right. Now, these disinformation campaigns, let's not mince words here, oftentimes promoted absolute falsehoods, verifiable falsehoods, things that you could go out and just check for yourself to see that they're untrue. That having been said, when asked to justify this, I can imagine that a surrogate for Vladimir Putin might say, well, during the Cold War, the United States and Western Europe did something very similar via Radio Free Europe, which the CIA funded and which sent pirate signals into Eastern Europe and Russia, promoting American democracy, capitalism,
that's right.
anti-communist ideas. This is where the substance starts to take into effect. First of all, there's the philosophical substance, which is whether or not you are more supportive of democracy or autocracy. Okay. To the extent that we understand the current Russian political system as being a kind of sham democracy, in which one candidate wins in excess of 70% of the vote, which is
that wasn't good.
Yeah, which is an absurd result. So you have the philosophical component, but you also have the substantive component, which is that if you are sending me disinformation to, to convince my citizens of one thing or another, and I send to you facts to convince your citizens of one thing or another, is there not a difference in the way that we're, despite the fact that on the surface these appear to be very similar campaigns?
Well,
right?
Let me put it to you this way.
Does that point make sense?
If I cut your purse
right
while you're sleeping and steal all of your copper,
right,
but you cut my purse when I'm sleeping and steal all of my silver, is there a major difference?
Well, one, did you deserve to have your silver stolen?
That's definitely not the issue. We can, right? Because whether we deserved it or not, we still did it.
Right.
The point being, my answer is you both stole, right? We're trying to split hairs and split hairs on the back of the devil here. It's kind of what we're doing, right?
Right.
On the first question here is, ought one send information to influence one's elections in the first place, right? And this is why I'm getting to bring it back to my original thesis. If you don't get to claim foul if you're participating in a similar kind of foulness on the geopolitical stage.
If you regard your actions as being a kind of foulness, I think that's the point. It's a little hair splitty, I understand, but...
That said, though, you did say, you did talk about substance, and I thought that was important. And I will say this, that I wouldn't push myself too hard on this relative line.
Right.
Because even if I never engaged in any kind of geopolitical antagonism whatsoever.
Right.
Yes, I could claim that if someone tried to hack my elections, I'd have some, if you will, moral capital to be able to say, look, I never do this to anyone else. I expect it not to be done to me. You guys did it to me. I'm going to take this with utmost seriousness.
Right.
And I'm going to act as if this particular espionage that was done by me is as serious as some kind of violence threatened. There's that. But there's also, a rival country rounds up all of my diplomats and summarily executes them, and then puts an army on my border.
Right.
Okay, so there's substance, right? So and here's where the distinction between formal warfare and not comes in, right? Regardless of how a country is, how evil a country is, say, or how malicious a country is, if Mexico all of a sudden killed all America's diplomats and threw its army on the border between Mexico and America, America could morally claim that it is under threat of war.
Right.
Right? So there's that, right?
Right.
And regardless of what we say about the geopolitical thing, that is a fact. And there are certainly substantive things we can say. There's substantive things that, regardless of our sort of our broad moral character as nation states, that we can say, look, we're being aggressed upon.
Right.
Right. So I'm not trying to deny that.
Right.
Right. But nevertheless, I would think, or rather, you would think that you want to be able to, as a government, as a country, respond to things that threaten your country with the gravity that they deserve, right? And we might want to respond, say, to an alleged hacking scandal, right?
Right.
Americans might want to respond to it with, let's just say, hypothetically, the gravitas that it really deserved.
Right.
Which is, we would like to consider this act.
Right.
In the most serious terms. We would like to consider it akin to an act of war.
Right.
And we would like this to never be done again, and for you to make formal responses and apologies and all the rest of it. But Americans, as I would allege, have hamstrung themselves.
Right.
Because they've done these things to other people.
Right.
And so
well,
by the same logic, if they want to be able to defend themselves, they should stop attacking other people so they can react properly when it is proper for them to do so.
Right.
Right. So ironically enough, what that would mean, if that's true, right, and that's a pretty contentious thesis, I would say.
Right.
What that means is that defending yourself, right, preparing yourself to properly prosecute foreign issues,
right,
means refusing to waste your time and resources on prosecuting foreign interests.
Right.
And losing losing your moral capital, the moral high ground that your country would have if it didn't actually participate in those things.
Right.
Right? Like the difference between the Iraq War and, say,
World
to
War
be
clear,
II, right?
the invasion of Iraq did enormous damage to the debating capacity of the United States on a global level.
Right. And I mean, maybe this is a bit of a false, it could be a bit of a false dichotomy, but I would certainly say that America's involvement in World War II was not looked upon with, cynical suspicion. Oh, there goes America doing its foreign wars again. Right? America was isolationist for a long time, and it decided to come in on this war, and it came in with moral force.
I mean, I hope we don't get too bogged down on this, because there's a certain argument to be made that when you get to become as powerful as either the United States or Russia or China, you cannot help but be entangled by broader foreign or international events.
Well, okay,
to such a degree that you are required to, from the outside looking in, preemptively strike.
Well, okay, I'll throw you a bone. All right.
Right. Well, just for people who are listening, the two of you out there, it would be as if a bull were in a china shop. The bull has no desire to break the vases, but by its sheer size and weight, it cannot help but break a few vases.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not entirely sure if I necessarily agree with that image on the basis that it takes out the moral complexity and the moral dimension. It seems a little too pat and simple, but I do think there is some truth to it.
No, I absolutely agree. And
If for no other reason than to consider that currently the United States economy is 23% of global GDP.
right.
Right. So
That's crazy. What a crazy number.
it's the third most populous country in the world. And it is of such enormous value on a global level that to want to change anything anywhere at some point or another by sheer size of the American economy and its power and its influence, you will have to confront the United States, right? This is just a minor point, but
No. Actually, I think it's important and on topic. And to continue that point, for those listeners of you who haven't read much of Machiavelli,
right.
You should. Right, he's actually written a lot, and more broadly,
He's got a new book coming out, I think.
yeah, that's right.
Right.
He's
He's
written,
doing a signing at Indigo.
He's written the art of War.
The Art of the Deal.
That's his last book.
Right.
Right. History of Florence, which was his first book.
Right.
And what's the most common, the most popular book people know of, The Prince, which is he wrote that book in the
Right.
middle of his career. Actually, he wrote it near the end. But anyways, it doesn't matter. Machiavelli at the time, right? He's an Italian living in the later part of the 1400s, right?
Right.
14. Yeah, he lived around the Savonarola time, which is the turn of the 15th century, right? Pretty sure. Anyways,
Well, come on, this isn't a history
don't
podcast.
murder me.
This is a philosophy one.
Please don't murder me if that's wrong. But I'm pretty sure that's right. But anyways,
Right.
he's living at a time when formal diplomatic relations between city-states in Italy and other larger states in Europe were growing.
Right.
And the role of the formal ambassador was stabilizing, right? And this
Right.
is actually really fascinating because it was widely recognized at the time that ambassadors were formal spies,
Right.
right? And this isn't a cynical thing. This is just a fact that you can't. An ambassador, who's the physical representation of another political entity, right, who's resident in your city or in your place,
Right.
just by virtue of being there and listening to things and keeping track of things, they're spying on you,
Right.
right? But you don't actually get to have your ambassador if you don't let them have their ambassador.
Right.
So either both of you know nothing about each other, or both
Right.
of you know something.
Right.
And that seems to be the preferred state that nations operate, right? Most nations will prefer to exist in a political situation with formal spies and formal espionage than to have absolutely no political contact whatsoever.
See, there's another
Right?
issue that's just dawned on me in discussing this, is that the conversation thus far presupposes an understood level of intentionality in any of these acts going back and forth. So,
Like what specifically?
well, let me explain.
Yeah.
The reason why Al Qaeda chose the United States to attack, right, is because they wanted to establish a caliphate in the Middle East. This is the best of my understanding. They wanted to.
Al Qaeda?
Yeah, it was a sort of a longer term project for them.
Okay.
Right, so they called the United States the far enemy because there was the near enemy. The near enemy were the Arab governments that were opposed to the goal of rebuilding a caliphate, which is to say all Arab governments. Now, Al Qaeda believed that if they could foment revolution in the masses and overthrow these governments, that this caliphate could be created. But they first had to demonstrate that the governments were not to be feared, that they were weaker. And how better to demonstrate the weakness of these comparatively weaker governments than to attack their benefactor, the United States, right? If you can attack the benefactor and show the benefactor to be weak, then by extension, these dependents must be even weaker and therefore prone to, downfall. Now, justifying this, of course, was the fact that the Arab governments, Saudi Arabia in particular, had allowed the United States to put bases in Saudi Arabia. So an infidel government put military bases on holy land after the Gulf War. But to look at it that way is to think that the Americans were being necessarily aggressive in what they were doing. And I suppose there's a reason to think that. But if you're the American government, you're thinking to yourself, we have to maintain a certain standard of living for our people, or we lose power, like internally, domestically, we get voted out of office. Okay, and we're not able to push through the agenda that we seek to create a better nation. So, how do we maintain this standard of living in an increasingly globalized community? Well, we have to protect sea lanes. So there might not be an immediate threat. There might not even be a faraway threat for global trade. Most global trade occurs over sea, even to this day.
Really?
Air travel is not as
it's not efficient,
fundamental, or you just can't move as much over the air. It's for the reason why the Chinese government is building artificial islands in the South China Sea. It's why they're setting up military bases in Djibouti and Sri Lanka and Pakistan. It's because sea lanes, more than anything else, are the network of global trade. If you're the United States in the early 1990s, with the Soviet Union on the wane, and America, I believe, coming out of a recession at the time, you need to maintain a standard of living. You need to. That is your mandate as a government. And when you're as big as the United States, the entire world is your backyard economically. So you set up bases on major sea lanes. And what is one of the most important sea lanes in the world, especially with regards to oil? The Persian Gulf. So as long as you have a presence there, again, it's not aggressive, not necessarily. I mean, that, I suppose, depends on your definition, particularly with regards to America's relationship to Iran, but it could be an entirely defensive strategy and otherwise pacifistic, depending on how you look at it.
Well, right. So
there's the intention of the act can be misunderstood.
It can, or once done, misused,
or misunderstood intentionally or otherwise.
This is why I would say that because nation states seem to prefer some minimum level of espionage over none at all. Right. This also means that you're voluntarily, as a nation state, you're voluntarily accepting some level of foreign geopolitical antagonism,
regardless of intention.
Right, but you're accepting that it's almost an inevitability. Right? At least if, let's just say there was some sort of moral utopia here, and you actually did have spy networks, but you only used them defensively, right? You only used them for counter-espionage, right?
Right.
But that's not the case. So what I would say then, so I'll make my final argument, is that I understand that some minimum level of espionage is inevitable, right? Right. But these nation states have a moral obligation to restrict it as much as possible.
Right.
Right. So I'm not saying that because America and the West participates in any kind of espionage that leaves them unable to criticize Russia, right? And Russia's geopolitical machinations. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that I think it's fair to claim that the level of espionage and the level of geopolitical antagonism that the West has engaged in over the last 20 years, 30 years, has been excessive. Right. And it's because of that excess that makes their outrage at Russia's geopolitical machinations fundamentally hypocritical. And if we want to be able to formally criticize and reprimand Russia for its geopolitical actions, which I think we ought to, we have to be in a position to do so anyway.
Right.
We're under the obligation to curb our own excesses first.
Right.
That'd be my argument.
So that's been probably one of our most intense hours of conversation.
That's definitely a pretty quick hour, isn't it? I thought we just started, and then I just looked at the time.
We did a lot of leeway going into this argument.
Yeah, it's true.
A lot of teeing up.
It's true. But just so we finish it, do you disagree with that?
I'm still on the fence because going back to the point that we made earlier. Hi, I'm Mike. The other guy's Aaron.
And you've been listening to Thought Fuzz.
If you like the show, tell your friends. If you didn't like the show, tell your enemies that you did. And don't forget to rate us wherever you heard this.
Follow us and continue the conversation on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Check out our show notes for all the links.
And finally, we'd like to say thank you to our listeners for supporting us. We couldn't do this without you.
Until next time, keep it fuzzy.